Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Israel Matters. Once again, I'm Rabbi Pesach Wolicki, and with me is defense strategy, military history expert Elliot Shodoff. How you doing, Elliot?
Good. How are you, Pesach?
I'm doing well. We have a lot to talk about today, continuing our in-depth history lesson about how we got to where we are today. We got some wonderful feedback from the last episode, and I'll be sharing a little bit of that. But before we get to that, as always, or as usual, I would like to share a biblical insight. And this one I think will be especially meaningful to our Christian viewers. Not all our viewers are Christian, but a fair number of our viewers are Christian. But to our Jewish viewers as well, it should matter. This is Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2. It shall be at the end of days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established at the top of the mountains and will be elevated above the hills, and the nations will stream to it. Now, the verses that follow this also talk more about this mass pilgrimage of people from the nations of the world to Jerusalem and to Israel at the end times, and they are all coming to serve God, to worship God. And this is very important. The prophecy, it's repeated by other prophets as well. And as we know, this is the first time in history that there is a mass pilgrimage of people from all the nations of the world coming to Jerusalem to worship the God of Israel. So this is obviously talking about the time period that we live in. This has never happened at any other time. And I wanted to focus on the word stream, that the verb used to describe this mass pilgrimage in this particular verse in Hebrew is v'naharu, which means to stream, which it's an interesting verb because really what it is, and in Hebrew you can do this, you can do it in English too, but in Hebrew, it's very easy to do within the rules of the language where you take a noun and turn it into a verb. And the verb, it just describes the activity of the noun. So the word is nahar, and that's the word for river throughout the Bible, right from the beginning in Genesis, where it talks about the rivers flowing from Eden. They're all called nahar. And this is a verb form of the word river, right, or stream. So to stream to it, literally to river to it, to flow like a river more than like a stream. It's really not a brook.
Right.
Yeah. So the description of the nations all coming en masse to Jerusalem at the end times and using this verb to stream, I found interesting because there's many scenes in the Bible or prophecies in the Bible that describe masses of people gathering somewhere. Happens all the time. And this is not a normal verb. This is not a conventional verb. It could have said they will gather or they will travel. It could have used a much more conventional term. And the term to stream struck me that it has, and here I'm not going too deep, just a very basic understanding of the symbolism. Water flows naturally. Water is not even alive. It's not animate. It just flows naturally. And it never stops. If there's a river flowing, it's flowing in the middle of the night, it's flowing early in the morning, it's 24/7, it's every day of the year. Rivers flow in perpetuity. And again, unconsciously, it's beyond unconscious, they're not even animate. And I thought that that's part of the image here, that it's not just describing masses of people, masses of members of the nations who are coming to Jerusalem, but they're doing so, it's not even really a decision. It's a draw. They're streaming there. They're drawn by, it's almost like by a gravitational force, that they're just drawn there naturally. And it's also describing that this will be a perpetual state of affairs. This will be an unceasing flow in the way that a river flows. So I think that those two elements of this image of the flowing of a river, that again, that it is a natural draw and that it is in perpetuity, are really, they give us a little more texture and a little more depth to the image. And it's also very true to the experience that I know, Elliot, you and I have both had a lot of interaction with Christian Zionists and Christian pilgrims to Israel. And we find that when we talk to them about why they came to Israel, why are you visiting Israel? They talk about it as though it's just the most natural thing, that they were drawn, that it wasn't, it's kind of instinctive. And this to me is captured by this word naharu, that they flow there in a kind of natural way. So I just wanted to share that little nuance from the Hebrew. I thought it was
Can I add
appropriate.
a twist to that occurs to me?
Sure.
Rivers flow downhill by nature of gravity. Here we're talking about rivers going uphill by the nature of a spiritual gravity.
Ah, that's true, because Jerusalem is a high up place.
It says to the high mountains, right?
That's true, and rivers don't flow towards Jerusalem because Jerusalem's pretty much higher than almost everything around it.
Exactly.
Wow, that's a cool idea. So the nations flowing to Jerusalem, they're being drawn by this, again, the gravitational force of the higher power. That's beautiful.
Yes.
Oh, cool. Nice
All
insight.
right.
Right now, I'd like to share an email that we got from one of our viewers. And in this email, he asks a question about episode 13. And I'm going to put that question to you. And Elliot, maybe when you answer the question, you can then use that as a jumping off point to get us back into our discussion, because it's very relevant. Here's what he writes. And his name is Josh. He's a 20-year-old student at American University studying foreign relations and national security.
My kind of guy.
Yeah, and apparently he met you once on one of his trips to Israel. And he writes, quote, "I'm a big fan of the series. I think that the logical way that you both describe the incentives and pressures upon leaders and states goes deeper than the usual analysis from Westerners inwards on the region. This is one of the reasons that I'm such a big fan. My only wish is for longer episodes." Sorry, Josh, that's a double-edged sword. There's a lot of viewers who don't want longer episodes, and we're going to keep it the way we are. But I appreciate that. I have a question, quote, "I have a question regarding episode 13, Josh writes. Elliot, you explained that Nasrallah is in a tight bind because he promised reprisal for any killing of Hezbollah operatives. And since it happened last month, he's under pressure to execute a successful attack on Israel in some form. That was what we discussed last episode.
Correct.
Elliot, you suggested that such an attack might take the form of a border raid to blow up a tank or kill a few soldiers. Obviously, Israel is aware of this strategic game. You said yourself that this situation could be dangerous because Nasrallah needs to claim some sort of victory. It seems like until Nasrallah won't stop ordering small attacks until he gets a win, and until then, IDF soldiers' lives are in acute danger. Right? In other words, what he's saying is Nasrallah has to get a victory.
He's going to keep trying till
he's got to keep hammering away. He's got to keep firing in all directions up here until he gets something that he could wave in front of his followers and the media as a success. Josh continues, "I know that the odds of a border raid actually killing someone are low, but they aren't nothing, not to mention that killing of soldiers could lead to an escalation. So why doesn't Israel just lob Nasrallah a softball that will take the pressure off him and also will make the soldiers safer? I'm thinking an observation post without soldiers near Hardov, or maybe an unmanned vehicle. Allowing Hezbollah to shoot a rocket at something that doesn't have humans in it might seem to me like it would be beneficial to both sides here, meaning allow him to claim victory over something that we don't really care about. I would love for you to weigh in on this and tell me where I miscalculated."
So first of all, thanks for the question. You haven't miscalculated. As a matter of fact, this week, Hezbollah posted a video showing Israeli soldier dummies, in other words, mannequins dressed as Israeli soldiers in certain positions, apparently trying to do just that. We also did it in the past. There was a Hezbollah attack that we kind of set up for them to hit an empty outpost and empty vehicles.
But was the goal of those what Josh is suggesting?
It was close. In other words, we knew an attack was coming. Let's say this. The one that happened in the past, we knew the attack was coming to this particular place, and we just let them hit an empty outpost and with missiles. And it was in a place that was not near any population, so it was a very controlled sort of event.
And did it have the result that Josh is describing, where Nasrallah then declared victory?
Yes and no. And here's the catch. we being Israelis, and I say that sort of cynically, but also because of what Israel is, that we can't keep stuff that secret because too many people know too many secrets. We were very quick to publicize, we got you. So we took a lot of the joy of victory out of it. We basically made him look like an idiot.
Which defeats the purpose.
Which defeats the purpose. Now, that's almost built in, and this is maybe the flaw in the strategy. Look, if there's an attack on one of our outposts, we must announce clearly whether anybody was there or not. I mean, that's the nature of Israel. That's not something that can be kept a secret. And the idea that there were vehicles there without anybody there is a very quick recipe to the story getting out that the whole thing was a setup. So the fact that they publicized this week that we had dummies in an outpost means that they for whatever reason will not be satisfied with that kind of an attack. There's an added, call it a downside, to allowing them to do something like this. And I'll start with an Elliot law, and that is that any strategy, whether it's military, political, or whatever, the more it looks like a Rube Goldberg, contraption, the more likely it'll fail somewhere along the way. Okay? Which is the basic rule of KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Every step that leads to another step, and of course with Rube Goldberg it's all inevitable. In the real world, every one of those steps has other alternatives that can take you off in a different direction. So to leave it out there just like that and say, okay, it will suffice and we'll sort of wink at you and you'll sort of wink at us. Today that's not going to work. Social media is too strong on that. Transparency, openness, too strong on that. He's got to declare something more than a hollow, I fired a couple of missiles. They've done that already. And they missed. So hitting something empty and missing are pretty much the same.
So is Josh correct in saying that the lack of success at a retaliatory strike by Nasrallah could lead to an escalation because he has to keep trying?
Yes, we talked about this. Look, there's a basic rule, and it's not mine. It goes back centuries, but most commonly quoted was chief of the German General Staff in the 19th century, von Moltke. No plan survives the first contact with the enemy. In other words, once the shooting starts, this idea, going back to the Rube Goldberg, the idea of this will lead to this, will lead to this, will lead to this, doesn't work that way. A stray round, a missed shot, even with precision weapons, we've seen it. We had a missile a few weeks ago that we fired at Gaza. We fired at Gaza, and it landed in a kibbutz in Israel. Happens. Doesn't happen often, but it happens. And every time one of these events occurs, there's always a chance that it will lead to inadvertent escalation. And I use the word inadvertent rather than unintentional. Escalation is always intentional. It's just not always the intent to escalate. In other words, the decisions are intentional. They're not accidental. But inadvertent in the sense that neither side woke up that morning looking to start a war. And that's always a possibility. It's very, very hard to anticipate that sort of thing. And I think that actually segues well into what I wanted to talk about today, which is the war in 2006, because nobody woke up that morning looking to start a war.
Yeah, this takes us back to where we left off last time.
Exactly. Okay. Now, just a few words of preface to it. Through that year, I mentioned this last time, starting in the fall of 2005 and all through the year of 2006, Hezbollah was taking a beating along the border. Now, when I say a beating, I mean they were launching all sorts of operations that were being thwarted because we had moved frontline infantry units, the paratrooper brigade and the Golani infantry brigade, up to the Lebanese border. And all of a sudden, they were not facing the troops who very good guys, but who were not trained in high-level infantry operations. Tank crews that were pressed into infantry, engineer units, and the like. They became more and more intent on a successful operation, and we knew that it included trying to grab soldiers. And here I want to make very clear, I don't use the word kidnapped. I think we talked about this already. I'll say it again. Soldiers serving in the line are not kidnapped. They're captured. But still, captured is captured, and this is an operation, and it's an act of war, and all of that. And we knew it. We saw these things coming. We saw them in May. We saw them in June. For the previous number of years, this scenario had been played out in our war games. In other words, this was not news. This was not surprise. And by the early summer of 2006, we had gotten it down to the point where in June, we had a war game in the north that was so accurately predictive of what actually happened in the war in terms of what they did, that when the war broke out during the first week, we were joking that Nasrallah must have gotten his hands on the war game and using it as his plan for the scenario. It was that accurate. On that morning, and here I'll tell you sort of an interesting aside. When you live through historical events, when you participate in them, you don't remember the date, you remember the days of the week. So I know it was July something, but it was a Wednesday. Wednesday morning, they launched the attack. I was actually giving a lecture to a group near the Dead Sea. Totally, it was just another Wednesday. And I got an SMS, and I said to the group, listen, I'm sorry, I have to make a phone call. I think a war has just broken out. And they looked at me like I was drunk. I'm sorry, I'm serious. I called, and sure enough, and this was this was like 10 o'clock in the morning, very, very beginning of it.
Can I ask who the call was from?
From the Army. The SMS was from the Army, and I called my unit just to check in. Where are you, and how soon, how quickly? I'll come back to that, because part of the story of the war is that while Nasrallah played according to the war game of June, we didn't. And that was one of our failings. They had sent, this is, we know in retrospect, they had sent a large group of fighters across the border. They were waiting in ambush. 2 vehicles of a reserve unit that was on its last day of duty, and they know that too. They keep track. It's not that difficult. They know when units are coming in, when units are going out. It's observable. Reserve units, when they start packing up, you know they're packing up. Last patrol of the duty, they didn't follow procedures precisely. The 2 vehicles were too close to each other, and they were attacked. These are things that we know. We also knew pretty quickly that both soldiers whose bodies were taken, Goldwasser and Regev, were killed on the spot. And due to a whole bunch of operational mess-ups at that point, and a lot of it had to do with complacency, being lackadaisical, and that's part of what happens when you're in the line. I say that critically, but after 3 weeks, you get bored and you get sloppy, and sloppy gets people killed. And that's not about these particular guys. It's a general rule. A tank was sent after them. The tank followed a predicted path. It went over what could euphemistically be called an improvised explosive device. It was about a ton of explosives, blew up underneath it, killed the 4 guys in the tank. And the Israeli government made what I thought was a good decision, and that is enough is enough. We're going to go to war with these guys. That was possibly the last good decision the government made for the next 5 weeks. Now, as I said, there was a plan, there was an order. If we were talking now 15 years ago, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I can tell you now it was called Magen Haaretz, defend the land, or shield of the land. And it was a detailed operational plan of what to do under these circumstances. The chief of staff at the time, General Dan Chalutz, had been commander of the Air Force, and he made a decision that morning that the war was going to be won from the air. And he basically never initiated the operational plan that had been prepared and practiced for years. Now, on the one hand, I can appreciate an Air Force guy wanting to win the war from the air. As a matter of fact, it's never been done. This would be a nice time to try. And I can tell you that as somebody in the ground forces and who hangs out mostly with ground forces people, we love the idea of winning the war from the air. We think it's a terrific idea. It means that we can either stay home or sit back on a base and drink coffee and let those wonderful, amazing guys in their flying machines take care of it. I hear some planes going overhead now on cue above my house. The problem is it doesn't work. Now, as far as I'm concerned, at that point, he had not yet made a critically failed decision, but he was about to. Because what he didn't do, what he should have done, this is Wednesday afternoon, is that he should have called in the heads of the ground forces and the commander of Northern Command and said to them essentially this: gentlemen, we're going to win this war in 3 days from the air. But just in case we don't, on Friday early afternoon, we're all going to meet here in my office. And in my opinion, it's going to be to raise a toast to Shabbat and victory. But if not, you are going to present the fully updated operational plan for a ground offensive that will begin next week. He didn't do that, and that was the failure. The Air Force performed brilliantly, and as a ground forces officer, it pains me to say that, but brilliantly. They had what was called a bank of targets, in other words, a list of critical targets that everybody had calculated that if you knock out all of these targets, Hezbollah collapses. And within 48 hours, the bank was destroyed. In other words, every target on the list was destroyed, and rockets increased. And at this point, what should have happened didn't, and what did happen was very human, but still very wrong. What do you do if you're convinced that you can win the war from the air, and all you need to do is knock out this list of targets, and you knock out the list and the war isn't over? Put together a new list.
I guess if you've already painted yourself into the corner that the only way you're going to win the war is from the air, and that's your only option, then that's what you do.
Right. The perspective is I was right. I just didn't hit hard enough. Right? Whatever, if force doesn't work, use more force and just pound them that much more, and they will collapse. And the more targets that got destroyed, the more rockets were being fired.
Elliot, let me interject a question here, just to kind
Sure.
of, as I'm not a military man,
Okay.
and just digesting everything you're saying. When someone says, like, even though there's a war game battle plan that has been practiced and it includes the ground forces, and then when the chief of staff says no, we're not going with that, we're going to win it from the air, isn't there? It sounds to me, again, as someone who thinks more politically and less militarily, it sounds to me like what he's saying is, we're going to go to war, but we don't really want to go to war.
That's right.
Therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to do this in the way that produces the least amount of casualties as possible. and we'll just do everything from the air. And, you know, we don't really want to conquer territory anyway. So we're kind of going to war, but we can win this war without really going to war. That's what it sounds like to me.
We're going to do it on the cheap.
Is that an accurate assessment, what I'm saying?
That's a perfectly accurate assessment. As a matter of fact, there was a congressman whose name escapes me at the moment who said something very similar to General Patton in the summer of 1944. He was visiting the front and he said, you know, General, this is going to be the last war that's fought with people. From now on, it's all going to be technology. And Patton, in his usual flowery language, which I'll censor down slightly, turned to him and said, you know, it's SOBs like you that have been getting soldiers killed ever since there's been warfare. Okay? The idea that you can do it cheaply is it's an understandably, and this is what I said before, it's understandable, it's an understandably recurring theme that never works.
All right,
and
so an important question.
Yes.
I'm sorry to cut you off again, important question. In the great historian, Barbara Tuchman, in her book, The March of Folly, she defines folly as when not anything that ends up failing is not necessarily folly, because there's all kinds of things that can happen. But she defines folly as when a decision is made by a leader, and at the time there was prevailing wisdom that was expressed that said this is the wrong move, and they do it anyway. Were there naysayers who looked at Chalutz in the eye and said this is the wrong move?
Okay, so the answer, first of all, the answer to your question is no, but let me come back to that in a moment. There's another component to folly that she puts in that's very important, and that is that it's a policy that follows over a number of successive generations of leadership.
Right.
In other words, folly is not just a bad decision. It's a long-standing bad policy. So Vietnam was folly because it went essentially from Eisenhower, but through Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon.
Or the peace process with the Palestinians.
Fair enough.
That's a good example. In other words, we're about.
That's right, okay.
We're almost 30 years in.
That's right, okay. So that's the call it the Tuchman version of Einstein's definition of insanity, which is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Here you had a different combination, and it doesn't, in that sense, doesn't fall into her folly definition. It's almost the inverse of her folly definition. And that is, how did we get to where we were that there was nobody to call Chalutz to task on this? And the answer is because there was a prime minister who had virtually no military experience, a defense minister who had even less military experience than the prime minister. So the only guy in the triumvirate of real decision-making who knew anything was the Air Force guy of a military that is primarily a ground forces military. And how did that happen is an interesting sequence of events that's germane to all of this. And I'm glad you asked the question because I wanted to get to this. Chalutz was appointed by Ariel Sharon. When Ariel Sharon was prime minister, his defense minister was Shaul Mofaz. Now, Ariel Sharon, you can like him, you can not like him, you can like his policies, you can not like his policies. Ariel Sharon was a world-class military genius. Nothing you can do about it, he was.
Okay? At a historic level, yeah.
Yeah, world-class historic level, okay? And he knew it, as most geniuses do. Shaul Mofaz was a former chief of staff. He had been a paratrooper. In other words, a ground forces officer, okay? So both of them with a great deal of ground force experience. Sharon starting out in special forces, paratroops, ultimately becoming one of the great armored commanders as well in 1973. And as I said, Mofaz, ultimately chief of staff. In other words, two men, two generals with a huge amount of ground forces fighting experience. And I don't know this for sure, but I can guess, and I've studied Sharon a bit, he probably thought to himself, I don't need another ground forces general at the table. we've got all we need of that
That's a
category.
very interesting speculation. That's a very interesting speculation.
Where I really don't have knowledge is Air Force. Now, the Navy is its own sort of sphere, but the Air Force, ground force sort of interactive connection is critical. And my guess is, and it's an educated guess, but it's a guess, that he said, you know what, this guy will give us something that we don't have at the table. And if Chalutz had come to Sharon, in other words, had Sharon been prime minister, and said, hey, Arik, I'm going to win the war from the air, Sharon would have said, have a seat, have some more coffee, we'll get to you when we need you. The problem with the Olmert-Peretz-Chalutz triumvirate is that A, they had no knowledge whatsoever. In other words, this was the only professional among the three of them. And Peretz in particular was incapable as defense minister. And here I should just mention to our American audiences, the Israeli prime minister is not the commander-in-chief as the American president is. Okay, the orders to the military go through the minister of defense. So the civilian position that commands the military is the defense minister, not the prime minister. And here you have a defense minister who was incapable of calling these people to order. He asked some interesting questions along the way, apparently, and from reading from reports, but he accepted whatever answer they gave him because he wasn't in a position to do otherwise. And again, that very enticing, and look, Chalutz is a very bright guy. He's very articulate. He's sharp. I'm sure he made a very convincing argument. Listen, we're going to go in, we're going to beat them up for 3 days, and it's going to be over by Shabbat. And they said, wow, great. And I mean, he commanded the Air Force. Who should know better?
Right.
And there we are.
You could also see the argument being made, Israel's greatest advantage was in the air.
Correct.
She's like, let's just play to our strength.
Right, except that you've got to play to your strength against your target.
Right.
Okay, and against a quasi-guerrilla light infantry force, the Air Force is the least suited for
victory.
Critical victory. Critical
yeah,
victory.
In other words, they are suited to, they can inflict damage and they can...
As I said, they did. They took out 50% of the rocket capability within 24 hours. They did a tremendous job of taking out targets. Okay, the problem is that an F-16 isn't terribly effective against an infantry squad that's properly scattered and dug in.
Right.
It's kind of like using a sledgehammer against a mosquito. And the rockets keep coming. Now, at the same time, we're convinced there's going to be victory. And here, I'll just tell you my personal story. That Wednesday, I didn't get called up. On Thursday, I called the Army and said, no, what's the story? They said, no, we've decided not to call up reserves. Now, calling up reserves was integral to the original plan. I said, okay, so what does that mean? Well, we're not calling up reserves. Okay. Thursday at about 7 o'clock in the evening, I get a call, come quickly. So get into uniform, my stuff is already ready, zip over to my base, where I meet my immediate commander, very close to this day, dear friend. And he's walking in also. I say, all right, great, they called us up. Who else is coming? He said, nobody. I said, what do you mean nobody? He said, no, they just called up you and me. I found out later that he convinced them to call up the two of us so there would at least be somebody there to man the phones. We got to our war room. It was locked. Nobody had the key. I kicked in the door, and that's how we began the war Thursday night. On Friday, around noon, they sent us home. The war was over. And on Saturday, the North got blasted by a massive barrage of Katyushas. And at 11 o'clock Saturday morning, I was back in my car, back on my way to the Army. And through that personal story, you can get an idea of how little is understood on the higher levels of what was going on, and at the same time how confident, overconfident they were that it was all going to be over in a couple of days.
Wow. Elliot, it'll be a bit of a cliffhanger, but I think we should stop here and pick up the story at this point.
In the war,
because,
yes.
We've just had the beginning, what went wrong in the beginning. And I also want to end on a note that when we go back to the question that our friend Josh asked, it sounds like the way this started, where there's all these little skirmishes and Nasrallah's not being successful in the skirmishes and he keeps trying, and that leads to the escalation. There is, at least in potential, a serious parallel to what's going on now and the fear that this could escalate to that same point. So let's leave it on that note. We will resume next week where we left off.
Let me just interject one teaser for next week. When the war is over, Nasrallah said, if I had known that was going to be the response, I never would have done it in the first place.
Which is interesting.
So we'll come back to that as well, because that's part of the ongoing story.
Elliot, once again, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you. Folks, our viewership is growing, and it's thanks to you for obviously spreading the word and sharing it around. Please continue to do so. I know that you who are viewing it know how valuable these videos are, and I will restate, feel free to email us, elliottchodoff@gmail.com, elliot.chodoff or elliottchodoff on Gmail. It doesn't matter if you include the period. Or my name, Pesach Wolicki @gmail.com, or find us on Facebook. And if any of you would like to schedule for a group that you have, whether it's at school, Josh, or whether it's at a group that you have at your synagogue or church, or just a group of people who are concerned about Israel, if you'd like to have your own briefing, please be in touch with us and we'll be happy to accommodate. God bless everyone, and let's remember to keep praying for Israel.